Hi everyone, this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and we're continuing with our webinar series where different experts from different African countries are sharing their opinion with respect to the African energy sector, specifically the issue of energy transition and whether we have the political will to move forward. Today we have Ms. Nabukalu from Uganda, but based in the United States, and she's going to share her opinion with respect to the African energy sector, energy transitions, but specifically issues concerning biomass and charcoal with respect to the supply chain. But before we start, I would like Ms. Catherine to briefly introduce herself.
Right, so my name is Catherine, as Dr. Nalule has mentioned. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I work in energy efficiency, so the public sector, but also I have my background in energy systems and management, so energy policy from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So I also have a background in supply chain management, and my expertise is mostly on movement of goods, from place to place and trade. So in respect to the African energy sector, I will be talking about the logistics of biomass.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine, for the introduction. And I must note you have a chapter in our African book where you focus on the issue of charcoal and biomass in the energy transition era. And the book is also focused on energy transitions in Africa. So today I would like you to summarize your opinion. Just in 7 minutes, you give us your opinion with respect to the African energy sector and energy transitions. And then afterwards, I'll do some follow-up questions, and that will be the end of the webinar. But before we start, I'd like to briefly read out your opinion to our viewers. So, Catherine, you opined that, just to briefly read out what you said, you're like, forecasts of increasing energy demand by Africa's rising population have led to substantial investments in the supply of modern energy alternatives and grid connections aiming to supplement biomass and consequently reduce energy poverty. However, the consumption side of these energy sources require further research. And you also point out that more gas and electricity supply have not directly translated into the increased consumption, as many urban centers are still relying on charcoal as a source of fuel for cooking. So I'll not read out everything, but in summary, you opine that most of the people in urban areas and even rural areas, they're still relying on traditional biomass, including charcoal. And as such, we need to focus our discussion on how to move away from charcoal, maybe to other sources of modern energy when we are talking about energy transitions in Africa. So this is a unique topic because in most cases, most people focus on renewables when you're talking about energy transition. So it's very good to see this side of the story where we know the reality, what's happening in our countries, in the rural areas and urban areas, people are still relying on traditional biomass. So could you please expound more on the issue of supply chain of charcoal in Africa with respect to energy transitions?
Of course, and I think what you've said is very important because a lot of people are really looking at renewable energy in the context of providing more electricity through centralized, electric generation. That's going from solar panels to hydroelectric power to natural gas. So it's going to be a very diverse future in terms of energy. But the main question here is, where are these de facto policies leading us? While we need to consider the future containing a lot more electricity supply, it's very important for us to look at these changes in tandem with what has remained the same, over the years, over decades, and what is projected to still remain the same, which is the supply and consumption of biomass.
Yes, Catherine. So I think we can go ahead with your presentation so that you can expound more on your opinion. Would you like to share your slides?
Yes, please. So, right. So I will start with really summarizing what you just said. So, as we've mentioned together, there's going to be more grid connection around around the African continent with an aim of supplanting biomass. A lot more policymakers are aiming at the more electric generation as a way of supplanting biomass and basically reducing what is termed as energy poverty today. So, in contrast to electric and gas ovens, you're seeing that there's a traditional charcoal stove. It's still highly accessible in Africa, and it's still affordable to most people. So that is still going to stay, according to my, according to my research. That seems it's going to stay in energy households, and most people are relying on biomass because it's not susceptible to outages and blackouts when compared to the newer electric systems that are going to be, that are being supplied by centralized power plants. And lastly, there's going to be more gas and electricity supply, but that will not exactly translate to increased consumption for reasons that I'm about uh, to mention in following slides. So, firstly, um, this is the status of biomass. As I've mentioned, it's important for us to look at the status of energy in sub-Saharan Africa, most especially the things that have remained the same over centuries. So last year in 2019, Africa accounted for more than 50% of world charcoal production. And this is not only for its own consumption, but it's also exporting to different continents, as we mentioned in our book chapter, right? So most charcoal is produced from freshly cut trees, and all this production is done in wide open forests. So in very traditional earth kilns, and biomass is going to be 80% projected to be 80% in African energy households still, and various countries like Uganda, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Tanzania still see it as a big proportion of their energy supply, local energy supply. So there's a lot of projections that say that, biomass is still going to stay, 20 years from today in the African continent. And this is still with the increased generation of electricity. So on one side of the slide, you have charcoal bags in an open market. And this is something that is commonplace in African urban centers. This is a picture from Uganda in Kampala. And you have similar images from Ethiopia, Rwanda. You have similar images in Tanzania and also Nigeria. So on the other side, you have firewood, which is also a finished product, as you see there. And this is both of these sources of energy are used for cooking. And one might say that these are used by, say, people with less incomes. But we found that even as incomes increase, people still choose biomass for various reasons. So these are we detail some of these things in our chapter, but this is the status regardless of people's levels of income. So moving on to the next slide. So this is the status of energy poverty, of energy policy around the continent. So because of the reality that I just described in the previous slide, there is a lot of charcoal bans in all these countries. So Nigeria has a total charcoal ban on charcoal production. And Tanzania also has bans on charcoal production, especially in their Miombo woodlands, which are fast depleting because of charcoal production. There's a lot of instruments that are used to cut trees, some of it's machinery, and the process can also be very manual with people using pangas and axes. So in some parts of Uganda, they've been outlawed. The use of machines has been outlawed to slow the process of tree cutting, to basically reduce the throughput of charcoal producers, so that less trees are cut over time, because the policymakers still recognize that people need charcoal in their energy systems. There's also license-only transportation, so people that carry heavy loads of charcoal would have to be licensed. So that, in a way, limits mass transportation of charcoal as as a source of energy, but also firewood, because these trucks tend to be overloaded when they transport charcoal to mostly urban centers. And lastly, there's bans on overloading. So most of the time, because trucks that carry charcoal are overloaded, there's a lot of regulation that should limit the weight of goods on all vehicles, so that they transport less at a time, but hoping to translate that into less production. So at the same time, there's a lot of they're using these policies, but also a lot of African governments are being very, they're taking a lot of initiative to increase the supply of high density energy, which is very linked to development. For example, if you look at the countries with the larger dot, which represents the amount of energy output in megawatt hours per project in for newer energy supply, South Africa and Nigeria are producing some of the more bigger projects with more energy, more density, and that is expected to be related to more economic growth, right? But that the two realities, restricting charcoal and restricting firewood, comes with a different reality. It does create a different reality in the energy mix. In this case, it creates options, right, for consumers. So most consumers are now seeing electricity as an additional option rather than a way to transition from older energy systems to more traditional energy systems. So I did look at the equipment on the supply side, and I found on Jumia.com, in the case of Uganda, that a traditional charcoal stove, right, an oven that's an electric oven, so it could be natural gas or electricity, can go between $189 to $600 USD, and the conversions are right at the bottom here. So 189 to 600, and when you compare that to the modern clean cook stove, that's about 50 to 10, $10 to $50. But when you compare that with wood fuel, that's literally free. So because people will just use basic stones to prepare their food without spending on not only the technology but also the maintenance cost. If you look at the charcoal stove, in the right in the middle, it's painted. Therefore, the cost of rusting is diminished and the cost of maintenance is really reduced for the consumer. So that makes it preferable to the electric and gas ovens, which are $600, and a lot of them are manufactured abroad. And when they're transported to Africa, they may not have spare parts on the market, depending on the specific model. And if you look at the amount of food you can cook with the modern electric oven, see, it's quite limiting in case families are of bigger sizes. So you'd find yourself in a situation in Africa where consumers have options for, depending on what their needs are and depending on what suits their consumption needs, and what also suits what is available in terms of consumption technology. So the concern here is that even as we supply more modern energy alternatives for cooking, the technology and the consumption side should also be invested in, because if it's not cheaper, we will have supply without consumption. And if it's not available, even though it's cheaper, people will use the consumption technology that is available, the basic stones that you see in the third diagram, which is for firewood, and also the middle image, which is for charcoal. And consumption is a very important part of sustainability for the energy systems. So finally, my recommendation is we need to study and invest in consumption technologies. We need to engineer the consumption within the system so that the modern energy alternatives that are being provided, say by Power Africa, are being used actually by the consumers, especially for the mission of replacing biomass for cooking in households. And also sustainable forestry is important because as the projections have showed, there is going to be more tree cutting to produce charcoal. There's going to be more risk for wildfires because charcoal is produced in open forests. And also the countries that are producing a lot of charcoal and firewood do not really have the forest areas to actually sustain the production, as we mentioned in our chapter. So there's also going to be a need because of that for alternative sources of charcoal. There are a lot of companies coming up these days to produce briquettes from waste materials. And it is very important that such alternatives are looked into, because if you have projections well extending well beyond 2030 um, in the biomass sector, I think it's very important to look at a way to produce them without harming forests. And lastly, the health implications of using charcoal need to be noted by most people in Africa that are consuming it, because charcoal produces carbon monoxide. It's a very serious public health risk, and we need to figure out a way to consume charcoal in ventilated areas, because given it's the technology that we have, still consuming charcoal, but outdoor environments are generally better than verandas or indoor cooking.
All right. Thank you very much, Catherine. Maybe if you could stop sharing and I'll just do the follow-up questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much. You've raised very important issues, and that's the reality, honestly, in Africa. Most
Right.
of our people in rural areas, even in urban areas, they're still relying on traditional biomass. So in your presentation, you've tackled on the issue of costs. And I see for traditional biomass, like the photo you had of the two traditional stoves, mostly used in villages, it
Right.
doesn't really cost anything. So
Yep.
there's zero cost there. And that brings us to the issue of affordability that
Yeah.
is well addressed or emphasized in the goal 7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In order to ensure access to modern energy for all, it has to be sustainable, accessible, affordable. And now I want to focus on the issue of affordability. So how can we shift, or how can we transition to renewable energy when we are seeing that these modern energy sources are expensive, like you've highlighted in your presentation? And then traditional energy, it's not expensive at all. Like in rural areas, it doesn't really cost a lot to go cut a tree and
Right.
then set up a fire or whatever they do. So in your opinion, how can we handle the issue of affordability when we're shifting from traditional energy to modern energy, especially for people in rural areas?
Right. That's a very good question. Especially that really has a lot to do with what people want to spend and also the ability to spend. Sometimes it's the incentive, I think. It's a lot to do with incentivizing people to use a charcoal stove versus the incentive of using an electric oven, right? So first of all, availability. How many shops are selling these type of products in the rural areas? It's usually not there, but usually there's no shops in these rural areas selling this transitional technology on the consumption side. But also the issue of there's almost no disincentive in these countries to actually supplant biomass or to reduce the supply of biomass. So you when you look at most energy markets in Africa, production is banned, but consumption isn't, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of bans on charcoal production. Some countries have total bans, like Nigeria, and yet when you look in the open markets in the urban centers, this energy is still trading as if it were legal, right? On the production side. So the policymakers need to ask themselves, where does it come from? If it is an illegal product, first of all, but also I think that there's got to be more local production of these technologies that support more that support more consumption of the new technologies, of the new energy technologies. So Africa has a lot of engineers. We have a lot of people that are able to produce and test and supply these white goods in a way that is suitable to the African market. So they can still supply electric ovens and gas ovens that are fitted to the market, but we don't have this infrastructure locally. So I think it would be great for local governments to invest in local production of these consumption technologies so that the spare parts are not only affordable but also locatable within the African market, so that people can actually not only transition but also feel that they're buying an item that is sustainable, that can be repaired right across the street from where they live.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a very important issue, and it also brings in the issue of local content, which most African countries are talking about, but something that we haven't really focused on with respect to bioenergy or the development of traditional energy. Because with local content, we're mostly focused on extractives, oil and gas, and mining. But I think you've raised very important issues. If we're to ensure that the local people are actually if we are to get their interest to buy the products, we should show that they are local products and they can easily access them and they can easily be repaired. So I'll not ask any further questions because you've discussed everything and they already have a video with you and Professor Reto, where you expounded more on the issue of charcoal use in the energy transition era. And obviously, we have your book chapter, which is focused on the same topic. So this will be the end of our webinar, but however, I would like you to do the closing remarks, just 1 minute. What is the way forward for African countries with respect to the over-reliance on traditional biomass in the energy transition era?
Right. So, in summary, my message is uh, going to be quite simple. As we produce more modern energy alternatives, given that we have all these resources, there's enough sun to produce solar, there's enough hydro these days, although there's risk to it because of the receding forest areas. I think it's very important to not only focus on production, because production is costly. Most of the time, the governments are getting loans to produce it, and they're expecting it to be profitable by it being consumed by the local people in Africa. However, if consumption is not looked at, then there's going to be exceeding production with very little consumption levels because of the competition from biomass, and also competition from a range of different different types of biomass, because biomass is not only charcoal and firewood, it contains other different types like dung and leaves. So as we look at production, let us also look at consumption and really target cooking, because it's very interesting, because it's a public health issue when people still consume biomass, especially the way we're consuming it and the rates we are consuming it at. So as we look at production, let us look also at consumption, but also the consumption technologies and the rate of consumption, because that ultimately affects the sustainability of these fuels on the local markets.
All right. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you very much for authoring the brilliant book chapter on charcoal yields in Africa. And this will be the end of our webinar. Thank you very much, our viewers. Do not forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Victoria Naluli. The video will be made available also on our NGO called the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative. The video will be featured on the social media for the NGO and also on the website. So stay tuned and don't forget to share the link with all your friends. And this marks the end of our webinar. Have a lovely evening and bye-bye.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.